even though we talk about something called feminism, we really should be talking about something called feminisms that emerged. But before we get there, I want you to go back a little bit and talk about some of the ways in which the younger women institutionalized or made their presence felt, because some of their actions were quite dramatic.
Yes, although they started with what might be considered very undramatic, and that was the creation of consciousness-raising groups, small groups of women who met together, and by sharing some of their concerns, they, one, found out that their concerns were not unique, but shared by many people, and two, because they really focused very much on private life. But they soon began to find ways to really capture media attention through large-scale activism. Now, there is one downside to that, and that is that too often the story of this younger wave of the women's movement has been told from the point of view of New York City. New York City is the media capital of the world, and a lot of women were in a position to actually command media attention or develop ways to command that attention. On the other hand, in New York City, there were many, many splits and divisions, whereas if you look at the women's movement, say, in Omaha, what you're going to find is that there generally was just one women's movement, and people didn't make these fine theoretical distinctions.
Tell us about the women's movement in Omaha.
Well, the women's movement in Omaha quickly, and other places like that, quickly developed consciousness-raising groups. They spread like wildfire. I think they spread for a couple of reasons. First of all, women are accustomed to having fairly intimate conversations with other women. The only change really was politicizing those conversations, but it was felt very natural. But then women began noticing often local situations. They went into the universities big time. They began developing women's studies programs and having demonstrations that demanded programs like that. In one city, Madison, Wisconsin, there was concern about the inequity in the provisions of sports for women and men, and women dramatized this by conducting a sort of undress-in movement in which they marched into the men's locker room and began changing clothes there because the men's locker room was so much bigger and better and had better showers and so on. But they did it because they knew it would get publicity. There began to be yearly major mass demonstrations in which some of these people from Madison and Omaha would come to Washington, D.C. or New York City to come. But there were also just lots of local actions designed to capture media attention. One of the very typical moves of these younger, often very mischievous and creative people were to take words that were usually slurs directed against women, like witch or bitch, and to turn them around. So in New York City, there was a group that called itself Witch, and they did kind of guerrilla theater, going into the streets, dressing up in different ways.
Which stands for the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. We might as well spell it out.
Exactly. And, you know, that continues today, this turning around of a pejorative and claiming it and saying, well, I'm proud to be a witch, I'm proud to be a bitch. That was, I think, very much a part of the spirit of the younger women, and at first it was not always appreciated by the older women who were afraid that it was going to turn off people who came from more traditional cultures, perhaps more religious cultures, etc.
And you've written about Elizabeth Sutherland Martinez, a woman of color. Tell us about women of color in this movement in Omaha, Nebraska, or places outside New York City.
Yeah, I get very impatient with the stories of the women's movement that depict it as a white movement, because doing that is really erasing the activism of women of color. Very, very early on, for example, a social worker called Fran Beal created a Black women's consciousness raising group which began issuing manifestos and articles. Elizabeth Sutherland Martinez is unusual because she joined the women's movement at a relatively older age. She is a Latina who then went to work in the Black civil rights movement in the South, but then experienced, along with many other women, the fact that there was plenty of sexism in the civil rights movement. She came to New York. She was part of something that was called the Third World Alliance, which was an attempt to bring together feminists of many different colors. And she was very unusual because you didn't have very many Latina feminists in New York at that time, and she was working primarily with Black feminists. But there really was a small but growing Black feminist movement that arose at exactly the same time as the dominantly white movement. But even the dominantly white movement was never 100% white. You had plenty of members who were people of color, and you also had coalitions. In Boston, an organization called Bread and Roses worked very closely with a Black group called the Combahee River Collective. At one time, for example, before the so-called Take Back the Night marches began, there had been a very disturbing spate of murders of Black women. And the Combahee Collective and Bread and Roses got together and organized a very big demonstration, big for the size of Boston, to march at night demanding greater police action in seeking to find out who committed those murders.
Amazing. And I'm thinking that the presence of African American women and Hispanic women, indeed, in the other stream of the women's movement is also rather significant. So I'm thinking of Pauli Murray, for example, or Eileen Hernandez, who was one of the early, she was, I think, in the first group of commissioners of the EEOC and the only Black woman on that commission. But then women like Addie Wyatt of the Meatpackers Union, who African-American woman leader in the trade union movement who joins with other women and becomes active in the commissions, various commissions on women, the Presidential Commission. And these women were also present in the founding days of NOW, the National Organization for Women.
That's right, and actually proportionally there were more women of color in that older stream of the movement than there were in the younger stream at that time. But it too is often misrepresented as if it were an overwhelmingly white movement.
Why is it misrepresented?
This is a very interesting question. I've given a lot of time to thinking about it. There's a lot of racism in this country, but what I find is that for some reason, particularly strong charges of racism are more often directed at women's organizations than at men's. I don't fully understand this. There is certainly a long stream of older historical reasons for this. It is often women, for example, women of privilege, who had women of color working for them in their homes, a relationship that's exploitive and deeply unfair. It may be because the women's movements tended at times to make kind of universal claims about how all women have this, that, and the other problem. We should all get together, and women of color might feel, well, our problems are a little bit different, or we don't share all of the same problems. But the fact is that some of the issues that both streams dealt with, whether you're talking about inequality in the workplace or whether you're talking about vulnerability to violence, these are equally shared. So there always were some bases of commonality, but all of this exists within a society that is just riven by a legacy of racism and racial inequality. So I don't think we need to consider it a failure that the women's movement wasn't more fully integrated. I think there are good reasons that, say, Black women or Native American women or Latina women had a need for their own feminist groups.